Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm doing fabulous, person. Good to talk to you.
Great. Today is episode 19, where we're going to be talking about World War One in our continued globalization series that we're doing right now. But first, we're going to talk about some good news in a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news. We'd like to take a moment to talk about good things that are happening in the world. In this case, it's good and bad news because it's bad news for certain countries, but good news in general for the countries I like and care about. So it's good news within our sphere of influence and good news for America. We're going to be talking about the cursed invasion by Ukraine into Russia. So, about a week ago now, the Ukrainians, unbeknownst to everyone, almost even high ranking NATO officials, but definitely not the US, definitely not Russia. No one else knew. But Ukraine, with a small coalition of roughly 300 to 400 soldiers, a QRF force and reconnaissance force, moved in an arrow, a spearhead formation through and started blazing their way into the Kursk Oblast. And an oblast is a state or a province of Russia or Ukraine or the Eastern European blocs. They have oblasts, similar to provinces. Sometimes they're named after the major city in that area. Kursk has a city, Kursk, within the oblast. Um, Sometimes it's the most heavily populated one. Anyway, so they were able to go in, take quite a bit of land. In about 72 hours, they had taken 680 square kilometers worth of land within the Kursk Oblast, roughly. Um, to give you scale, the Russian offensive, which started roughly about 3 months ago and cost over 100,000 casualties on the Russian side, they managed to get about 280 to 400 square kilometers worth of land within those 3 months during their entire offensive. So this was quite a bit more land. Um, I'm not reporting from a story. This is a coalition of stories that kind of amalgamize to what the situation is so far. Keep in mind, a lot of this is fast moving. It's changing. I've just been getting reports from a Ukrainian War Report YouTube series. They report daily on certain uh, tactical maneuvers that are happening on the battlefield. They're usually talking about like a specific battle or specific situation, not necessarily a top-down strategic situation. But um, based on some videos from them, Ryan Macbeth, and some others, it looks like what the Ukrainians have managed to do is push forward to a lot of different small little villages. And in fact, recently they knew that the counteroffensive was coming from the Russians, and they impersonated the Russians' officers and called into these villages and was like, "Hey, you guys need to evacuate. The Ukrainians are coming. We're about to bomb the crap out of this. You guys have to evacuate." And they told them which roads to evacuate, which just happened to be the roads that the soldiers, the Russian army was coming with their armor and other vehicles backed up. And of course, they were able to start HIMARSing those vehicles. So the Ukrainians are up to all kinds of shenanigans. They've managed to um, capture a whole bunch of conscripts as well, some Russian conscripts. Now, these are not like many of the soldiers who have been sent to the meat grinder. So this is the last thing I'll say before we can kind of open this up to discussion and get into some things. But when Russia first mounted their invasion of Ukraine a couple years ago now, and at some point, Vladimir Putin needed to do one round of conscription so far. He's mainly been getting soldiers through voluntary service within Russia, and most of it's been from the periphery. He's paying very well, like 9 times what he normally pays soldiers. Huge insurance bailouts if they die to the families. So plenty of young sons from the periphery have volunteered in the hopes of pay. And then a lot of Central African mercenaries, Indian mercenaries, and Chinese mercenaries have all volunteered to get paid from Russia to fight in this war and to be part of the meat grinder, frankly. But a couple years ago, Putin did do a conscription, and he conscripted a bunch of Moscow native sons, and these are the sons of the Russian mothers. And if anybody knows anything about Russian mothers are kind of a political social movement of exactly that. St. Petersburg and Moscow moms of these soldiers who put tons of political pressure and can cause revolutions, riots, and have been known to put pressure on people like Stalin and Putin has been not immune to Russian mother pressure. So when he was annexing these 4 oblasts that they're currently fighting over, that when he annexed part of Ukraine, he used the Constitution to enshroud those oblasts of Ukraine in the Russian Constitution, and he did this for a couple reasons. In the Constitution, he'd also changed it to say that no conscripted fighter would touch foot on Ukrainian soil. And so they would only be on soil that we had annexed and that was being occupied by Russia already. So all the ground that Russia had taken from Ukraine, those conscription soldiers could be there. They could set up defenses and so on and so forth. But more importantly, all the Russian oblasts that border Ukraine have been guarded by these conscripts as well, because it's on Russian soil. He needs to keep these men far more safe than the normal Russian meat grinder men, because the mothers are there, and it's politically unsound for these men to be killed in mass or captured. So as you can imagine, the many conscripted soldiers that are being captured right now as POWs in Kursk are not like the other soldiers in Russia. These ones actually matter right now. And what it's doing is it's actually putting Putin in a constitutional crisis. And so a lot of people are thinking that this might be a way of drawing away troops to a different oblast, and then there they can take southeastern land back, or the land that they've lost to the Russians. This is not really how you would do this tactically from many of the strategic war videos I've watched so far. It doesn't seem like this is a strategy that would make that much sense for Ukraine, considering the attacking force needs to be far larger than the defending force, and drawing a couple defenders from these areas to deal with your attacking force doesn't really help you if you've already taken your attackers away to attack there and you need a larger force to get that land back. So it looks more like Ukraine might be trying to cause some political instability within Russia, as opposed to just wartime instability, which they also have. A couple, like 3 really quick things to note. Putin failed and did not call a state of emergency for the first 5 days. I mean, like, he's basically frozen and not made any decisions about this. They've now finally decided to send a coalition force, FSB and different national guard, the Russian equivalent to their National Guard, and some other police forces are going to go over there with a conscript army and a coalition force, Chechens as well, of course, because they're always used for this kind of thing. And so we'll see how they do. So far, it has not gone well for them. So that's my good news so far. Yeah. What do you think about that, Richard?
Well, you were describing this switcheroo style incursion and invasion, and those 2 words are being used kind of like they're juggled around by the different commentators who are talking about this. What it reminds me of is 2 things separated by many, many decades: the Battle of Midway and the current political problem presented to the RNC when you have a change in candidate in the middle of the election cycle. The Battle at Midway is one of these historic moments. It's a turning point in history in World War II, in the Pacific Theater, for example, or specifically.
Yeah.
And that is that there are ships, there are American ships and there are Japanese ships. They are going toe to toe with each other, and there's an unfortunate amount of parity between the 2 different battle groups. In other words, this can be a really knockdown, drag-out fight, which will leave both sides really harmed. And unless I'm conflating this with one of the other major battles of the war, I'm pretty sure this was Midway. So if we check on this and make sure at some point. So the admiral from the Japanese Navy was sending out aircraft to go and confront the American forces, and changed tactics mid, kind of in the middle of the show, called aircraft back, and refit aircraft with torpedoes and took off the bombs that they were equipped with. So we had an ordnance switching for their application. And during this ordnance switch out, they lost time. And what the Americans gained was an upper hand in this battle because they were using the correct ordnance for the type of battle they were going into. The Japanese pilots from these aircraft carriers needed bombs initially, and then they realized, no, it's not bombs, it's torpedoes we need to sink ships. And in the middle of all that, they were compromised, and the war took a real change right then. And the reason I'm drawing that comparison to our modern political situation in America is that the candidates from the Republican Party had a pretty solid game plan for the entire last 3 years. They know who the candidate is. They know all the weak points of that candidate. They can really go in and attack based on the ordinance that they had. But the battle changed. And they were left with the wrong ordinance. And now while they're trying to switch that ordinance out, boy, are they in trouble. When you were looking at this Kursk Oblast incursion / invasion, we're looking at something very similar from a complicated political perspective, as you described very eloquently. We have a authoritarian regime that oftentimes authoritarian regimes can be pretty nimble and make big decisions fast, unless it's this level of complexity and this level of being in a double bind. And so we're getting to watch another modern day scenario where we have the wrong ordinance and the enemies they're trying to refactor things and are going to be they're taken off guard by this.
I can take this a step further because I really like what you're saying, but I would like to on top of this or double it up.
Please.
What you saw was a cynical short-term approach versus a more strategic long-term sounder approach to a problem. And I can apply this to all three of these analogies and scenarios. The Republicans have shown over the last 40 years that they are short-sighted. They are looking for solutions to the now, and they don't really care about the future consequences. We can see this across the board when it comes to everything from science progression to climate change to the way the vaccines were handled. Everything is about what is happening now, and anything down the road does not matter, and we'll deal with those consequences later. It's a very cynical way of looking at the world, because it means that you don't envision a future, because the future that you're creating with your actions right now is creating a future that it's not pleasant to think about, and it's not tenable. And attacking your political rival instead of running on real policy for once, like, hey, we're going to do these things, which is what the number 45 could have done. But all he did was air his grievances about how he lost and he should have won, or he thought he won or whatever for 3 years. And then he attacked Joe Biden. And that's really what they've done, is just attacked. And so when that's your goal, then of course it's going to fail. Like, it's absolutely going to fail because you haven't thought ahead of what ammunition you're going to need. And just like the Battle of Midway, the Americans had finally wisened up and said, wait, we're fighting this battle. This is the battle we're fighting. We need to have this ordinance here in the future because of these battles we've had now. And there were different phases to that battle that needed to be addressed. Yeah. And it looked as though the Japanese were short-sighted in this case and chose the short-term solution, which caught them dead to rights. And similarly, now to the Kursk situation, the Russians have made the foolish mistake of underestimating Ukraine again so many times. Short-sighted underestimation. They've underestimated Ukraine's ability to have autonomy and not notify the U.S. of anything. It's just like, we're just not going to tell them. They don't need to know. Like, this is our war. And I mean, the ability to keep this under wraps is so impressive by the Ukrainians, for them to be able to create this scenario to the point where you have Russians going around being like, why is no one complaining that we're being invaded? Like, you guys aren't saying anything about them doing it to us. And it's like, oh, the bully got hit in the face and now he's upset that he's been punched back, and he's looking around like, did you guys see this? He hit me back. And we're all like, yeah, we want him to hit you again. So these are all, the cynicism of Russia, the short-sightedness, every decision they've made. There's, besides Putin, it's funny for someone who's fantasized about this moment since he took office the first time and who's built it up in his head, that all of this dreaming is completely different than strategic planning and actually planning ahead. I mean, he planned with money. The war chest, he definitely did plan around that. He did create financial structures, but there's just so many holes in this plan and so much short-sightedness of it. It's like they're almost like the dogs getting the mailbox. Like, what happens next what happens when you grab the mail truck? Like, when you get a hold of this thing. And much like that, the Republicans, when they cried for Joe Biden, he's too old, look him to step out. Like, God, they wanted him to step out so hard. They were making fun of him, but they pushed it a little too far because they didn't really want him to step out. But then it happened. They got what they wanted. All of a sudden, Joe Biden's gone. You guys belittled him. You just talked about how old he was. And now look, you're the one stuck with the old candidate, crying foul, getting what you wanted, and you didn't like what you wanted. So, yeah, I think this is the difference right there.
The not to put too fine a point on the political not conquest, the political cycle, I guess is the way I want to put it, is what's great is that we're going to focus on the size of crowds that are turning out to political rallies. Let's focus on that and not really talk about these other super destructive ideas that we have going into this thing to, harm Americans financially, take away democracy.
And how's that working out for Trump focusing on crowd size? Because Kamala showing that her crowds are big. I mean, that's the funny icing on the cake. Once again, they're like, hey, well, let's talk about crowd size. It's like, oh, well, now you have to use AI as your excuse. Oh, it's AI generated crowd sizes. Only Donald Trump has real crowd sizes. Only Donald Trump has real crowds. You can only tell they're real because they shoot at him.
Whoa, yeah, I guess so. It's the immediate feedback.
Immediate feedback, yeah.
I like the other part. It's America. We don't throw rotten fruit. The other part of this, my favorite thing about the I hope that history really leans on this as time goes on, and that is the Ukrainian prank phone calls. That they get hold of radio frequencies and they contact people and it's war. I shouldn't be laughing, but it really sounds like they just improvise and do impressions of people that are taken seriously, and then it really messes up Russian plans for battle.
They left a Yelp review at one of the restaurants locally in Russia, and it was like, great food, loved the borscht or whatever, but the drive-through needs some work. I couldn't fit my tank through it. That was the review. You gotta love that, man. Like,
so they have a sense of humor that I can really get with.
Well, yeah, and I think maybe that might be a good segue into probably World War I, because you brought up 1914 when you were talking about that era, and I was thinking, back when the sides still were kind of getting along weirdly here and there, or like the soldiers at least, there was like some weird camaraderie across the board.
Yeah.
The war, because it lasted long enough that this very much went away, and the brutality of this war kind of snuffed that out over time. I hope that Ukraine, in a completely different situation right now, can maintain that positivity and that morale boost. They should know that they have my moral support, and I will loudly ask for the U.S. to continue to support, and NATO to continue to support Ukraine until the job is done. And I mean, they get everything back that they're supposed to get. Um, so
It would be amazing if there could be a country in Europe called Ukraine, and that Ukraine could also participate in whatever the new global order is for trade and industry, and the the development and continuation of technological designs such as semiconductor, such as all the support systems that go into semiconductor. Right, these
it'd
are
be
the
great if
types
they
of
could
things.
maintain their autonomy as a country. I agree.
I mean, yeah, their sovereignty of the nation would be wonderful. And what would be even more incredible is if something were to happen that caused the nation of Russia to rethink its approach as a sovereign nation and being a part of a global order. So, as a way of kind of getting back into this topic again, do you remember? So last time we spoke, we were talking about the Ottoman Empire. Do you remember the distinction that I made about the Ottoman Empire versus other types of empires at the time? Do you remember the terminology that I used?
Oh gosh, it feels like forever ago, but I knew it was a week ago. The distinction between the Ottoman Empire and the other empires at the time. So it's tough if we're talking about the height of the Ottoman Empire or towards the decline when they had basically gone past feudalism. They were really the first empire to, besides the Byzantines, were holding on like an artifact of the Roman Empire. But am I wrong, or
Yeah.
come on, let me know.
So in our conversations, let's really establish this idea of the approaches of organizing a society that is an empire. So one approach, which has served really well for a really long time, has been the Continental Empire.
Yes,
A
okay,
continental
I
empire
remember.
is a empire orientated around the finite resources within the borders of the empire. So we have um, the fruited plain, we have the mountains and valleys, we have the rivers, we have the shorelines, and we have the people that live within those confines, and that is as big as the pie will ever be. So the paradigm of thinking around a continental empire suggests that it is a shrinking pie. It can only be so large, and all we're ever going to be able to do is chop it into smaller pieces for everybody. And that leads to all kinds of different ways of approaching problems or addressing changes in the environment, whether those be cultural or financial or even climatic. That's always going to be, well, first, it's going to lag behind, so it's not going to be very innovative. And secondly, the concept of that pie as a metaphor is so important. It never gets any bigger. In contrast, a naval empire works with a pie that only gets bigger. It always has the ability to be a larger total sum of resources, people, geography, riches untold, right? The pie always is capable of being larger.
And this was happening while the Ottoman Empire was maturing and had
Yeah.
basically stopped expanding. Meanwhile, the
Yep.
Europeans, all most of them, and by this the big actors would have been Portuguese, the Spanish, the Brits, and the French. The
Well,
Italians,
let's not forget our friends the Dutch.
oh, and the Dutch. I'm sorry. Do not forget the Dutch, for the love of God. So there was other empires that existed outside the Ottoman Empire that were happening
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously as well. There was a Dutch Empire up there as well. Um, yes, don't we cannot forget the Dutch.
And
Um,
if you would do the whole analysis of the time, so let's talk about the period of time between 1400 and 1900.
so
There's something.
Portuguese are really this is their era as far as the naval. They were more dominant than the Spanish and the British at the time. They rivaled the Dutch. If I'm right, 1400s Portugal. Would you say these are equivalent? Um,
In terms of in terms of total coastline miles explored, except no substitute, the Portuguese were leading the way. They
okay.
circumnavigated the Horn of Africa. They got all up into
We
the
know they
Indian
got into
subcontinent.
Japan because of Shogun.
hmm So
Yeah.
the Portuguese were really mapping the southern Atlantic and African coastline, Indian Ocean, and were just making their way through. I mean, they were doing deep water navigation, but they were doing deep water navigation that really had an umbilicus to the land. But what's wrong with that? That's where all the trade and commerce is going to come from.
Sure.
Of course, they made plenty of enemies along the way, as you do. But for the Portuguese, when we talk about this distinction between empire type, the Portuguese have nowhere to expand but the sea. If you take a look at the Iberian Peninsula,
Yeah.
they're not going to go inland. Um, say what you will about the Spanish, they are not going to tolerate the Portuguese expanding geographically on land.
Nor will the
And
French.
likewise,
Yeah.
precisely. And so the Iberian Peninsula is really interesting in how it really sets up for these naval empire style philosophies around how do we organize our society, how do we fund the most how do we fund the lifestyles and living standards of the elite. I mean, this is what's driving this. We're not talking
Well,
about
to
elevating the experience of common people. We're talking about the elite.
and
Go
I'd
ahead.
like to add to that too, because so in the elite, we need to talk about the aristocracy, but also the religious higher the power of the churches, how are really hitting their maximum at the same time. And
Yeah.
so it was about commerce, it was about spreading the empire, but also the religious empire wanted to spread
Yeah.
too. And a lot of these wars came down to different versions of Christianity wanting to spread their type of Christianity. In this case, I believe the Catholics were the Portuguese and the Christians were the British. Um,
Uh, I
I
think
might be
I
wrong
think
about
you
that.
actually might have touched on something that may give us an interesting topic to cover in the future. But the Reformation of the Church, like the
Yeah.
distinctions between what is a Protestant and what is the traditional Catholic version of the faith. And let's not forget that there are Orthodox versions of the faith as well that
Sure.
weren't quite as expansionary, but are definitely. We, it, Let us not forget that the natural history of the Christian faith is not homogenous.
No,
It
the
is not
Russians were
just one thing.
killing other versions of Christianity. They were the Orthodox Christians as well as like the
Mhm,
Greek Orthodox, and you had them,
mhm,
killing Algerian Muslims, and then there was
mhm,
Algerian Christians. I mean, yeah, I mean,
mhm,
like
mhm.
really, yeah, the World War One. God, what a mess. Anyways,
So we've
recalibrate.
established the yeah we established the types of empires. The two strategies that are most meaningful to discuss as it pertains to Western civilization. There. Let's acknowledge that there is an entire and unbelievably fascinating history of Eastern civilization that we're not touching on yet because we just want to give it the time that it's
W-
um,
We'll have to go
that's
into Eastern civilizations, and then we'll have to go into the Mongolians, somebody who empire that's unlike most other empires in many of its different characteristics and hierarchies and so on and so forth. I don't know much about it, but I can't wait to
yeah
get there
we're
eventually.
we're
So
definitely I just want to say that the time it deserves because as we can already see we've touched upon 14 different things that are all important ideas here, and with that we now can make this distinction in the way that the German Empire thought of its place in the world. Now, Germany had been a nation that came into existence as one consolidated um, political system in the mid 1800s. Up until then, it had been a collection of all these different duchies and kingdoms and totally different approaches to how they would manage the land and people and resources
well, they were a
that were not
martial country for, I mean, the Teutons. I mean, they were a martial country. And by martial, I mean they were a warring country. They were mercenaries
yes,
for hire for many
yes.
European battles, and they were constantly getting into trade and then wars with Russia over and over again. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's what the Germans were do. I mean, it was this cycle of happening until the
Yeah.
1800s, when there was these reformations. But before that, that was kind of the cycle that was happening. I mean, they were fighting the Dutch off. I mean, they were, getting invaded by the Dutch, fighting the Dutch, fighting the Russians, getting invaded by the Russians, invading the Russians. And the Dutch were doing all, like, this was what was happening in that area of the map. I wanted to note that when we said the Iberian Peninsula, just think if you pull up the map, that's the peninsula that is encompassing the Mediterranean. That's just got Spain on the end, Portugal in the middle, and then you've got France right there. And it'd be like Belgium, Germany, so on and so forth. So if you're looking at a map, I just wanted to make that. And in this case, when we're talking about the Dutch, would be northern Netherlands area, Sweden, Norway. The Dutch was basically it was all of that. That was all just one empire. And then you had the Rus, who had broken off from that. That's Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. Below that's the Caucasus. And then you have Germany, that's sandwiched between the Iberian Peninsula. So hopefully I've given you guys enough verbal map to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here. In a really, hopefully, pull up a Google map if you can listen to this while we're talking, and or maybe our editor will pull one up, put a map up, and highlight what we're doing. We'll see.
All right, so now we have this established concept of the geography. We haven't really got into the European plane, but that's going to come up here in a little bit. But we have this idea that the naval empires are going to have the most access to ports and to the sea. They're going to be less constrained by having to sail through other people's territory on the way out to the ocean, or to the Atlantic Ocean. A nation like Britain seems like it would always be a marginal kingdom at best. They mastered the sea and are basically a floating. Not floating. They're what do we call them? Oh yes, an aircraft carrier in the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
So the British Empire was able to consolidate itself into what we would recognize now earlier than an empire like Germany did, and their participation in the expansion into the sea and then the conquest of all these different lands around the world made the British Empire unbelievably influential in European history, in world history. The sun never set on the British flag, right? There was this idea that they spanned the globe. And while probably no one in the empire thought of it this way, the way that empire acted, and the way that we can look back historically and do our tests, we can do historical tests on people and times, they clearly had an ever-expanding pie. It grew larger.
And the way that they gathered the pie was different than the way the French did, and the way the Spanish did, and the way that the Portuguese did. And there was a really interesting distinction here. Like, for instance, the French always valued volume, like the actual land mass. Like, the most land, that's clearly the most valuable, is just more land, which is why you see so much of Africa, and West Africa and Central Africa, was dominated by the French. But if you look at the way that the British were colonizing, there was a lot smaller amounts of land that they would necessarily grab. And this is, discounting even the U.S., the amount of colonies that they grabbed in the U.S. But what they would do is they would target the best land. And usually by best, because they were a naval power and they're surrounded by water on all ends, they looked for places that had ports and that you could create shipping access points to. Another way that they specifically expanded, and this isn't totally true through the entire way that they expanded, but they eventually started to allow for governments to have their own locally ran states in their own methods versus the French, who were draconian. Everything was about them running. And this is up until through the 1900s. The French, like a couple decades ago, were still ruling parts of Africa this way. And if you want to talk about Western colonialization and the country that's probably gotten the least amount of shit for it while being the most egregious, like, responsibly for it, the French, holy crap. And the pillaging of Africa that continues to happen to this day because of them. And why, if we want to talk about why Russia is being so successful in Central and West Africa right now, and the Wagner Group has expanded so rapidly, a lot of it has to do with the French being so brutal, and many of these African countries going, well, anybody's got to be better than them. Let's check out what these Russians are up to. which of
Yep.
course you and I know is probably a terrible mistake. But it's funny to think that basically the French and the Russians have been fighting over territory and been at some kind of quasi war for about a decade or so. So, anyways, a little, I said anyways again. There we go. Anyways, a little sidebar, and I said it again. Brian, do not edit this out. I just,
If you're following along at home, this is where the drinking game begins. This is where you take one shot of Kool-Aid.
by the way,
Not that we want to encourage responsible drinking.
my editor made a point, which now that I'm not editing, I'm not reminded of how often I use filler words and I say anyways after some mic drop moment of context that I'm adding. I don't know if it's even mic drop context, but I'm trying not to say anyways so I don't torture the crowd that's listening to us so much.
So getting back on track here, I'm stressing these modalities for managing a polity, for managing an empire, for managing the people and resources within the empire. I'm bringing this up because it turns out that if you use a test like I'm presenting here, like is it a continental empire, is it a naval empire, you could make a great many extrapolations or get a better understanding for what would motivate a people to behave the way that they did. And so when we this is a globalization series. We're not talking about World War One. If you want a great World War One series, go find Dan Carlin. Wow, that guy's
There's ton. Yeah.
um, yeah. His series is 38 hours long or whatever it is, and it's incredible. And he is a great distillation of the Guns of August and so forth. Right, there's plenty of commentary on this.
No, we're talking about World War One because it serves the purposes of us explaining how globalization came about and different
Yeah,
phases of globalization and different. I mean, because proto-globalization was kind of happening with the rise of the naval empires. That was the beginning
bingo.
of it. And
Yes.
that is why Richard and I are laying out like what the vibe was, what the reasoning, what the motivation, what the mindset of the country was, the country's ideology and
Right.
mindset, leading
And,
to World War One, where we saw really a big breakdown in what was becoming globalization, essentially.
and so we spent some time with the Ottoman Empire, not only because it's definitely determinant in the history, the natural history that we're describing, but that the Ottoman Empire was participating in the land-based globalized economy. They were a central feature, a hub, if you will, of the way that um, commodities and what ultimately weren't very commodities, but they were luxury items, were moving across the continent of Asia.
They were the
And
bridge between
yeah,
Asia and Europe. They were the bridge, the land bridge between, and Turkey remains that bridge.
yeah,
Istanbul is unironically famous for being a city that is split by part Europe, part the East. So,
yeah. And I'm using this term Asia as a kind of overly generalized term, but when you really when you get into the so geography is determinate in history. It causes historical events more than many other types of parameters that we could speak to. It's not a great man theory at all. It's, are you located where the rivers can move your products around? Are you located where there's a plain that you have to defend? Wide open, vast plain. Are you located where you can grow flat crops? Right. This is what I mean by being determinate. Not
yeah, and
we have these.
for present context, we can use the Ukraine-Russian war as a reason for that. It's flat plains in Ukraine. There's not a lot of elevation, so elevation is very coveted. The small hills that are
Mhm.
available, and the small valleys that are available, but that geography and weather pattern overlaid that geography causes mud to happen during the rainy seasons, which are two times like the fall before the ground freezes over and the spring before it dries up into the summer. Both armies really have to get everything done before those periods happen because all war on the ground shuts down. That's an example of geography on the plains of Ukraine right now. So,
And a really important idea that leads into so the we have the land the globalization where land is the um, it plays a central role in the movement of materials and goods.
hmm
You know, it sounds like I've totally forgotten about it and I'm discounting the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not. But if you want to use the Mediterranean Sea for transporting things, you still have to get there from East Asia overland. If you don't have deep water navigation, you can't really realistically transport a lot of materials and supplies the way that we've come to know and appreciate using a water route. There's still an offloading of things. There's still all these different other ways that things go from the marketplace in Cathay to a marketplace in the Levant
yeah,
or in Anatolia. So that's a key idea in uh, the determinate role that geography plays and what it means to be a continental empire and what matters to a continental empire. The setup here for European expansion and where these naval empires grew out of had a lot to do with two things that we're confronting currently. One, the Black Death had been ravaging Europe for a couple of hundred years, and over the course of that time, the European population was shrank. Historians have two different numbers by as much as two-thirds. So, 2 out of 3 people had disappeared off the face of the earth, and those 2 out of 3 people were no longer able to contribute to the reproduction of more people, the maintenance of crops, the production of crops, or any of the other value-added enterprises that human beings could be performing between
that
1000
led to like
AD.
trade. Yeah,
Yeah, between
yeah,
1000 AD and 1400 AD. They had just been wiped out. And that's critical because when we think about our modern situation, it turns out when you reduce the population, you reduce the labor force, labor costs more. And you get for the first time in human history a eat or at least let me rephrase that. Let's do an asterisk. You get for the first time in Western European history inflation based on labor costs. It costs more to harvest crops on these uh, I'm blanking on the terminology here, but essentially the way that Europe was divided up between the different aristocratic
yeah.
echelons, you had peasants farming, and oftentimes they were tied to the land. It was a whole scenario where it was a living. Can't say it compares to our
They
standard
were
of living now, but it was a
serfs
living.
or indentured
Yeah,
servitudes, feudal era. Yeah, you
there
were
we
a
go.
slave. You uh, died and lived by the whims of your lord that you served.
Yeah,
You were called upon to war. You could not go away.
yeah,
Justice was put upon you for
yeah.
whatever. And yeah, and then the king could call upon you too because he could call upon the lords and so on and so forth. Yeah,
So now all of a sudden there are fewer people to farm these crops that are the livelihood of these people in the aristocracy. And I'm just blanket describing Europe. I'm just hitting it with a broad brush here.
yeah,
And then the other part of this was you have all the inflationary causes of an overland journey of um, uh, the expensive things that would be coming from Cathay. We're talking about silks. We're talking about spices. We're talking about, you know, if you wanted to get
sugar cane from
sugar,
India. Yeah,
yeah, if you wanted something sweet in Europe, it had to travel over land. And these luxury goods, that was the word I was hung up on just a second ago. These luxury goods were not available at all to anyone under a certain level of aristocracy either,
sure.
but they were an important part of the livelihood and standard of living for the ruling class of Europe. Now, both labor and luxury goods have a really high rate of inflation. So when you have these pressures on all these different civilizations, and they have their own pressures, by the way, there are plenty of things going on that make it hard to stabilize anything. You can see why banging together the hull of a ship big enough to put 3 masts on and sail around Africa would be a worthwhile enterprise. You can see how, after that started happening, you could see how the proto corporation structure would evolve, and where you would get people contributing to the enterprise from different investors, so that you had enough money to buy the ship, the hardware to go into it, the cotton for the sails. Like, all of this goes into every one of these expeditions were proto corporate investments to the aristocracy in that part of Europe who was funding it. It wasn't just rich people that were doing this for adventure. They were literally trying to figure out how to reduce the cost of imported goods from Asia.
Yeah.
And
And grab
the
more land and grab undiscovered
absolutely,
land. Of course, anywhere you
absolutely.
could is like grab land, find new resources, bring them here. That will. And what was phenomenal and just kind of revolutionary idea was this idea that you reduce the number of threats of traveling over the land. The idea that there could be a robber. I mean, was so common. You had to go over multiple countries, some of them war torn. There could be cleansings happened, like they could be against your religion, the merchant traveling, the ethnicity of whatever you were. When I was studying World War One, before World War One, the world was just at war. It just
Yeah.
wasn't at a world scale. Like, not everyone was fighting and participating for the same cause necessarily, or some kind of unified cause where people teamed up. Countries teamed up with each other all the time before this. I mean, the Dutch caused many of the countries, like the Germans and all of them, had to team up to defeat the Dutch, and same with the Russians. At some point, the Dutch teamed up with the Germans to defeat the Russians. Like, there were world wars happening before that. The land was super dangerous all the
Yeah.
time and super expensive. Every time you had to go to a new country, you had to pay taxes and tariffs, and you know, you could be robbed, you could be killed. How many trips could a merchant really make? Your livestock carrying could die carrying the stuff. You could have the people die on the trip. We think about the Oregon Trail and how perilous that was, you
Yeah.
know. um,
Totally.
and the sea represented a place where you had a lot of enterprise had to go into making these ships that could travel in deep ocean. And so, by the very nature of the cost to get into the game, you reduce the number of competitors you had to trade with. First off, you really were competing against nature at this moment now, right? Like, you had to learn to navigate the ocean, and that was a big competitor on its own, or just a big force to go against you. But um, yeah, it's fascinating to see the confluence of forces start to merge together and create a momentum, or to the globe, and what was happening with commerce, essentially leading up to World War One, of course, but then also like those external pressures and the internal pressures within each country as well. So
Jared Diamond is the author of the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is
hmm
a really interesting look at all of this as well. And he really leans heavily on the role that geography plays in how you get the same scenario that I just described, which are land empires and naval empires. He then tries to apply that same theory to North America, North and South America, the Western Hemisphere, I should say, the total Western Hemisphere. And I don't know, for my purposes, it kind of falls apart. The theory that he uses to describe how you get this global movement of cargo happening doesn't hold up, I think, when you test it against the Western Hemisphere. And we can go into that later, because at some point we'll be talking about the Western Hemisphere specifically.
If you could do a
That's
quick summary, like maybe 2 sentence summarizing what his general theory was for the audience,
yeah.
and then like why it maybe didn't work
So
necessarily.
in the geography of the Eurasian continent, like this is a super oversimplified way to put this. So people who have read this book will think, well, you kind of got it, Richard,
Yeah.
but there was more to it. But the super oversimplified version of this is the movement of people east west created a chain of progress upon which innovation and wealth was built.
Hmm.
So east-west movement was really a natural condition for the shape of the Eurasian continent. Well, I just got done talking about the demand for trade happening, across Asia through the Southwest Asia through the Levant and Anatolia.
Sure.
So, I my statements here comport to what Jared Diamond is describing, which is, oh, well, look at where the mountain ranges are. The mountain ranges would, these passes here would allow someone to travel from point A to point B, and then here's some water routes, and it's a totally cogent way to approach the understanding of how you get the conquests of naval empires.
Sure.
Then he tries to apply it to North America, or well, again, let me just say the Western Hemisphere,
The
and say, well,
Americas.
look,
Yeah.
yeah, look, you don't look at your east-west distance that people can travel. This is a north-south connected hemisphere. There wasn't a lot of trade going from South America to North America. Like, you know, this is the reason why the people living in the Western Hemisphere would have had a totally different paradigm to operate from as empires were built by the Toltecs, the Mayans, the Incas, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have a completely different approach. It's part of what made the contact between the two hemispheres such an alien experience for both sides,
Yeah.
because the way each population of people saw their place in the universe was just fundamentally different. And so we'll get into the American experience pre-contact eventually.
Yeah.
Globalization in the context of what we're working with now is really a European modeled concept.
Absolutely.
So now that we have this basis for understanding the types of empire that existed leading up to the 1900s, now that we have a concept for what was driving colonization, colonization, because globalization is an idea that really is mid-century, mid 20th century. But colonization is what preceded it. And going as far back as the first proto corporations, we have an idea for the model that could be put into place so that if you had the wherewithal to put together some crews and some deep water navigational ships that are big enough for the sails required for the travel, this is where we're at the dawn of the 20th century. So, do you know you did some reading up on this? Do you kind of have an idea for the powder keg that sparked World War One? Do you have a kind of a
Yeah.
sense of that?
So, it's funny because anytime we start to go over this, it's like what really caused the war, World War One, and the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz
Yep.
Ferdinand.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You nailed it, Betty.
So Franz Ferdinand was a moderate, which means
Mm-hmm.
he needed to be assassinated because at the time, what was really in foe for European countries was parliaments. At the time, the turn of the century, from the late 1800s into the 1900s, parliaments had really, like, the first democracies, these first places where they were shedding the guise of like red crowns were going away, and countries were forming like crazy because as we had covered, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and so there was tons of countries collapsing. The Serbian Serbs were expanding at the time, and the Austro-Hungarians um, had gone into a deal with the Germans Now, these two parties had completely different goals for if they wanted to war. Um, the Germans at the time were led by, I guess, the grandfather of a Nazi, essentially, because he had very, what's his name? Fuck. God, now I can't think of his name. Uh, he was an expansionist, and he thought that the German state should expand everywhere, and German people were superior. He was a fucking white supremacist, essentially. God,
Are you thinking of Kaiser Wilhelm? Is that where you're
that
thinking of?
Kaiser Wilhelm. I was just forgetting his name.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
but essentially, and we're running towards the end of our time, so of course this will be great. We'll have a part two
Hmm.
of the World War One. But
Hmm. Hmm.
um, Franz Ferdinand thought that we need more of an authoritarian. He didn't use the word authoritarian. I don't know if it even was something that they were saying at the time, but more of a centrally ran country, and that the parliaments have gone out of control. And so he was
Yeah.
proposing like more like, hey, you should give more power to the king or whoever's leading the country, because now we're not able to get anything done. And at the time, a Bosnian who had it in his head a hero complex and got together a bunch of buddies, and they had never gotten over like a deal between the Serbians where they had to give up Bosnia to the Austro-Hungarians, Franz Ferdinand. And so he was like, hey, this Franz guy's visiting, we should assassinate him. Meanwhile, the Germans, Kaiser Wilhelm, because I think he just wanted to expand. I mean, basically, I think he wanted to expand the German empire. So he gave a blank check to the Austro-Hungarians in a deal that said like, hey, if you go to war with anybody, including the Serbians for sure, we got your back. But anybody, we got your back. Russia doesn't matter because Russians are there to help the Serbians probably. We definitely want to fight Russia, but we've got other plans too. Fuck the French. Like Germans were thinking this way, or Kaiser was at least, Wilhelm. And so that's kind of the ground floor. Franz Ferdinand goes to Serbia, he goes to Serbia, visits with his wife. Assassination attempt goes horribly wrong. Like 3 guys in the crew puss out. Another guy like has a jam, and the main guy, who I forget his name too, sorry about this, like
Princip.
fucked he fucks up and goes to a cafe to like I guess drown his sorrows or some shit. And the driver drives by the cafe with after the assassination attempt had failed a couple hours later or some other time. Oh, some guy had thrown a grenade, missed,
Yep.
blown up a truck behind Kaiser
You got it.
or behind Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand went to go visit the person who had been blown up, and what's the guy's name? The assassin?
I think you pronounce it with a hard C. I think it's Princip or something like that.
Princip.
I
Yeah.
say I want to say it's Gabriel Princip or something like.
So that guy
Yeah.
sees Franz driving, sees the driver stopped right in front of the cafe, and goes out and shoots him and his wife. Um, and
Sophie.
Sophie.
Duchess Sophie.
And but nothing like really happened right away. Like it's always told to us like right away everyone went to war, but like a couple months went by because people got before World War One, people got assassinated all the time. Like this was part of the deal. Like in the world, you just got assassinated. It was very common, and necessarily wars wouldn't always start because of an assassination. Um, but there's my ground floor. Uh, would you want to tell us kind of what our audience can expect on the next one? And
Yeah.
yeah,
So what we've done is we've described the inciting incident where these continental empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, which was late to the game of forming as a nation, so they didn't really have much in the way of colonies outside of Europe, right? We're talking about these alliances that were formed by these continental empires that were the perfect formula for what ultimately happened. But one thing I want to give the audience a sense of is that we're not going to describe the entire 4 years of the war. We're not going to describe the trench warfare and all this stuff. We don't even really need to get too much into what was going on with the in the Ottoman Empire, where Britain and France were assaulting the Ottoman Empire because it was convenient to really attack this sick man of the East, of
And
sick man of
because
Europe.
they had some vengeance built up in their mind
Mhm.
because of the Ottoman. A lot of European countries had a lot of vengeance built up in their mind about the Ottomans. So any
Yeah.
attacks on them was like fuck those guys because
Yeah.
like it was like that, right? Um, and studying this, by the way, I want to talk more about this concept, but this idea of country's karma, like a country having karma, and how like during the expansionist phase, usually it's violent and bloody, and a lot of other countries get all the harm from the country that's doing this empirism. And because the empires have a tendency to last so long, at least in the history that we're talking about, the people who pay in that empire that expanded while it's collapsing, first off, they always get double karma against, essentially, because their country's probably collapsing, it's weak, their rulers suck because their country's collapsing, and so on and so forth. And then they are getting attacked for the comeuppance for what their country did maybe 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever it is. But most of them weren't even alive when these transgressions went down. And so it's an interesting thought about this, like, country's karma. And I want to relate that to like um, how Republicans are freaking out that Mexicans are coming back and moving up to places that we might have taken from them at some point. I don't know if it's necessarily karma, but we're paying a little bit of the price of our country's karma by having the illegal immigration border situation right now. So I thought that's an interesting juxtaposition that we could kind of explore as well into this conversation. But
Before we sign off today, if you just type it into a search engine, June 28th, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is where the assassination took place. And this is so Archduke and his entourage and Duchess Sophie, they're in the Balkans. And they're in the Balkans for all these reasons that we have been kind of building to. It's about consolidation of territories. It's about the pacification of all these disparate groups and elements and different radicals and people that are there's a never-ending amount of strife and conflict in the Balkans, as our natural history has told us. And this happens in June. So we're at the doorstep of July, and the actual conflict, historically, as we would understand the assault on France by the Empire of Germany, happens in August, and it kind of midway through August. We'll have those dates and so forth when we start getting
well,
into
and
it.
the Russians very quickly going right into Germany on the tail as Germany's going over to France. Russia they were ready. And I'd like to. I know we won't talk about a lot of stuff, but I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about the revolution that happens in 1905 in Russia and how that leads to some interesting stuff that you'd like to share with us about 1917 in Russia. And so this is sprinkle a little Cold War uh, fairy dust on there for some theories that we're going to be bringing up. So hopefully we've teased enough of this fun stuff. I know if you guys are still tuning in from our Project 2025 days that we might have taken an abrupt turn, but we're let us swing back around. We're getting to modern history because we'd like to talk about globalization, and we'd like to talk more about America, and we'd like to talk about the Cold War that we think we're in, and so don't worry. Don't give up on us now. We will be talking more about American infrastructure. We'll be talking about the hope of
Mm-hmm.
America because we're very
Mm-hmm.
hopeful. But we
Mm-hmm.
have to talk about some of these really crazy events and how they transpired and why we're here. So
Geography is determinate, and we have the best geography in the world.
we do. Well, some of the best. Iran
Some of the
has
best
really good
geography.
geography. Taiwan has
Our,
pretty good
our,
geography, but
our
we
geography gives us multiple biomes, navigable rivers, shores and coastlines and harbors. When we talk
barely
about these types
any
of things,
land people to fight. Barely any people to
right?
fight. We have Canadians up
Yep.
there and Mexicans down there, and we've made sure that they're allies for now. So
To the extent that anyone would recognize that, given the modern narrative of our borders, it turns out we're actually in one of the most amazing inflection points in history from an economics perspective. That when we talk about these ideas of globalism and how I did this, we're doing this big sweeping conversation about what it means for globalism to exist in the Eastern Hemisphere as, these land empires. We are absolutely setting up the groundwork for what it means for globalism to be the modern thing that globalism is going to become, which is the way that the Western Hemisphere, North America, is going to continue to play a dominant role in what things get made in the world and what things get moved around in the world. And this is why we are at an inflection point in history that is even, it is on par at least with the advent of the Bretton Woods system that we're going to talk about in about three episodes.
Yeah.
So
I would say if Europe is responsible for proto-globalization and they're the main actors, and the climax, or the climax of the scene 3, or the final stage of their globalization period, is World War One. And then I would say that the U.S. becomes the main character or the main actor in the globalization show, and a bunch of the actors do get shuffled around. The players who start to become main actors as well all get shuffled around in this new era of globalization. So I'm excited to talk about the first act a little bit more next with World War One as we go more into it. So thanks to our listeners. Can't wait to talk to you guys again.
All right, from this side of the TV screen, this side of the computer screen, I'm signing off, Pierce. It's good to talk to you. See you next time.
You too, Richard. Take care.